Welcome to Getting Started. Getting Started, local strategies fostering broadband deployment. And a couple things to note, very tight quarters, so if you're going to keep the heckling going in here, just note that we're a little intimidated by the proximity. And another thing, and you can thank us later, we have no PowerPoint slides, so but we do have an esteemed panel. I'm Mike Wilson. I'm going to be moderating the panel. I'm with CostQuest Associates. If you know us, we're the folks behind the FCC's models, the National Broadband Plan model and the Connect America funding. But we've also worked for the state of Kansas with the pilot community programs and some of the modeling work here. But we're not going to talk about what we did. We're going to talk about what the folks, the stakeholders, and the communities and the providers see with respect to broadband deployment. So I'm going to introduce our panel. I'll make the introductions for you. Jay Byers, say hello, Jay.
Hello.
Is currently the Assistant City Manager for the City of Pittsburgh, Kansas. After working for 7 years with the City of Kansas City, Missouri, he worked in private sector technology and software development firms for 15 years. In his current position, his primary responsibility is managing the various technologies used to run the city. It's a big job. So thank you, Jay. Heather Griffith, who I've worked with, is the Director of Economic Development for the City of Fort Scott, one of the pilot communities. Heather serves as the team leader for that pilot community project, Fort Scott and Bourbon County Local Community Technology Planning Project. Heather, thanks for joining us. Catherine, right here. Catherine Moyer is the General Manager and CEO of Pioneer Communications, a telephone and communications company that serves residents in southwestern Kansas. She also sits on the board of Kansas Rural Independent Telecommunications Coalition and the State Independent Telephone Association of Kansas. Thank you. You're our one provider, supply side person, very important. Michael Koss, legal counsel with KLM, or the League, or LKM, League of Kansas Municipalities. Joined the league in January of 2012 after interning in the Government Affairs Department at Sprint Nextel. So he has some supply side knowledge. He follows telecommunications, utilities, and environmental issues for the state legislature. Lori Sherwood. Lori is currently the Director of Business Development for Advantage Engineers, telecommunications engineering consulting firm based out of Maryland. Thank you for coming all the way out here. It's quite a trek. Ms. Sherwood co-developed and co-wrote and co-directed the 18-month effort to obtain $115 million for the One Maryland Broadband Network and managed the $100 million ICBN sub-award, VTOP award recipient. Thank you. So I'm going to throw out a little bit of negativity. That's not actually in my nature, but I'll try to throw some positivity in at the end. I have an opening statement, and it's a little negative. Deploying broadband networks is complex, read expensive. Maintaining those networks over time is even more complex, even more expensive. As much as stakeholders, such as these, plan and take action to get advanced networks deployed in their communities, providers may not see the business case. Simply put, deployment or rollout of new technologies may not be commercially viable, with or without community involvement. After all, the business case is a business case. So you're powerless. Not exactly. There's actually a lot of things you can do to move the business case. There's a lot of things you can do to intervene. So that's what we're going to talk about this afternoon. So I'm going to open it up with a quick question, and it's a pretty general question. And you saw it from our last presenter from NTIA talking about public-private partnerships and the toolkits that they have. But what leverage can communities use helping in the deployment or recruitment of providers to bring broadband to communities? We hear about right away, permitting, pole attachments, leases. I know Jay and Mike, you probably have some experience on this. Any thoughts on what can be done to leverage what you have?
Well, I will say that I know that Kansas has an average pole attachment rate of about $3.25 now, which is half the national average. Also, state statutes for Kansas, I think it one of only 6 states that have permit decision deadlines regarding approval for rights of way. So I think as far as being a broadband deployment friendly environment, Kansas cities are right up there on the national level.
From the city point of view, of course, we try to make it easy.
Can you
for
guys
people-
talk just a little bit louder since you don't have a mic?
Okay, from the city's point of view, we try to make it as easy as possible for the providers when they come into town we're open, we're accessible, we make ourselves available. We want to make sure that if there's any regulations or any inspections that need to take place, that those happen in a timely manner. We try not to get bogged down in legal negotiations. Our attorneys have to review everything, all the agreements we make. All of those things tend to take time. They tend to keep people away from municipalities or from work, particularly in smaller communities. We try to make sure that we're not bad players. The money amount, frankly, those kind of franchise fees and pole attachment fees, things like that, they're not huge revenue sources for us, right? They're not completely negligible, but they're not the things that are going to make us decide whether or not to bring another carrier into town, right? So we'll certainly negotiate with those. Usually they aren't the reason why a carrier would come into town. It's more the working relationship, I think, that the city's trying to create.
Any other thoughts on that? I do have a follow-up question. Kansas City's has a unique perspective in that. They've worked with Google Fiber. Google Fiber has a checklist, it's out there on their website, of what cities can do to be put in a position to have gigabit speed networks symmetrical brought to their cities. But there's also a checklist that Google has that they don't share, right? And there's a lot of intangibles and some tangibles, and we'll never see that. But Catherine has a perspective from a provider standpoint on what providers might be looking for. You have a unique perspective in that you have interventions. Your Connect America Fund will be a Connect America Fund recipient. You've been a USF recipient. And you're in a very rural area, but we would love to hear from a rural provider's perspective on what you see, not only in the business case, but the intangibles from communities.
So I did laugh when we had our first sort of organizing conference call and said, I'm not really quite sure why I'm on this panel. Just because, as you can tell with the makeup of being the sole provider, but it's also a little bit different being a provider from a truly rural part of the state where, we're a cooperative. We were organized 60 plus years ago to, I think, fill a void where other carriers weren't coming in. The big players at the time, which at the time were the big bell guys, weren't coming in to serve that area, so they formed something. We did also have, as was mentioned, we have universal service funding, soon to be CAF, as well as Kansas Universal Service Funding that helps basically complete that business model. So when we are in communities and talking with communities, it's not very often that it's necessarily that we're being recruited per se. We're not walking into it's not like Google Fiber coming in. So it's a different relationship, and it's a relationship where for the most part we're already established, and whether we're established there as a video provider, a broadband provider, or a telephone provider, we're pretty established. So we've already had some of these conversations. We've had these conversations about pole attachments and franchise fees and whatnot. But we're also in communities, I think, where those pieces aren't quite as big a deal, I guess, because it's not a recruitment, it's not like a tax abatement, it's not like, come serve us and we'll give you this. And so we're having completely different conversations. I think to Jay's point, the biggest thing for us that we see is that relationship that we can build. It's that open conversation that we can have. It's doing things that are advantageous. So let's get away from, let's say, franchise fees and pole attachments, and let's get to what are things that we can do together to advance economic development in those communities. And I think for us, that's really the biggest piece. It's that two-way interaction, conversation, planning.
And I suspect a little bit easier if you're a smaller provider and you know the communities well.
Exactly.
And one has to wonder how, Google Fiber has been pretty successful. They've gone into places and had these conversations on the intangibles as well as the tangibles, but they also had some failures. And actually, right here in Overland Park, they had a breakdown in talks. But they've recognized that as key, even as a very large provider. Now, Lori's got a unique perspective in that you kind of straddle the line between supply and demand and somewhere else in the middle as well as a BTOP recipient. So if, and the advent of potentially having a Title II requirement as a common carrier kind of looking over us and tainting our discussions. So if a private or common or competitive carrier won't build out and expand a network, what are your options? And we talk about governance is a big thing here in the state of Kansas. It's a very political conversation. There was legislation trying to stop open access networks by communities, and I know that's a big topic of conversation. But what governance models exist, ownership models exist, and I do have a follow-up question on funding mechanisms. So any thoughts on that? And I'd like to open it up to anybody else who has thoughts on that, because that could get to be an interesting conversation.
Thank you. Now, the One Maryland project was kind of unique in a few different ways in that it's the only VTOP grant awarded by NTIA that was solely given to state and local governments as the owners of the network. And it was a very complex project that touched every county in our state. And it took a major effort to organize the grant and the governance model. So the way that we worked it out eventually was we actually did not formally establish any kind of public-private partnership to be its own separate legal entity, because we had joint powers issues and other state and local law issues that made it very difficult. So we really pulled all of the governments together into a consortium and held it together by a simple MOU. And it worked miraculously. But there were some challenges along the way, but we managed to craft the MOU in a way that required everyone to have skin in the game, which I think was a big factor in the success of the project. I know Laura spoke at lunch about the matching funds piece, and we were, the federal grant was $115 million, and there was an additional $40 to $50 million in matching funds that was provided by the state and the local governments. And my piece of it, the state built the rural counties, and the local governments in central Maryland built in our own communities locally. And so my project, just by the numbers, was 97 million, 800 miles, 650 anchor institutions, and $25 million of that was matching funds. And I think that the way that we really approached it collaboratively was we invited the private sector to participate. They declined on the upfront participation, but once it was built, we started to see that participation come in through open access, dark fiber leasing, and other mechanisms that are helping now to draw in some of the next generation projects off of the middle mile sector. So really, for our community, why did we go forward with such an expensive and large project? It was because fiber is an enabling technology. And when we're looking at the feasibility, the question isn't so much, can we afford it? It's, can we afford not to have it?
Right. So say you go through all this process and it's just not commercially viable. You are not in an area, and Heather knows this, you're not in an area that is receiving high cost funding as a rate of return carrier. You have high cost funding that's smaller. You look at cities like Chanute, who have fiber, who started a long time ago. What are your options? Heather, what are you seeing as your options as a community where we ran a model for you? It was a negative commercial business case. I think it was a negative $5 to $8 a month per subscriber to build fiber to the home in every home and business across Fort Scott. What are your options? I mean, you want to throw up your hands and say, I can't do anything.
I don't think it's that we can't do anything. The fact is understanding why we're in the situation that we're in, which is incredibly complex, especially when you're not into public policy. But I think we need to come together as a community, and our anchor institutions need to work together and consider that long term. As Lori mentioned, that we can't afford not to do something about it. So How can we leverage our buying power? What can we do when you look at what goes into the determination of the cost and the investment and the negative ROI that we received in a cost model, but then we look at the economic impact of if we were to have it, it's tremendous. So how do we close the gap between, are there things that we can do to make it more profitable, which some of those things have already been mentioned, I won't go back into it. But I think it comes down from my perspective to our businesses, and as far as how can our public entities in the community work with the businesses to make sure that we're not working against them. I mean, if we're all served by a provider that can't serve our businesses, what good does that do for economic development?
And that's the follow-up question is economic development. So a provider doesn't see a commercially viable business case. A community, and this is a public policy question. I'd love you all the way in, but I know not all of you will. But we saw the numbers from Stan this morning on the economic impact study. I'll use Bourbon County as an example. If you brought fiber to the home across the entire county, it would cost millions of dollars to do so. However, over that same 10-year period that we ran that cost model, between 670 and 2,000 incremental jobs. We're looking at already job growth, but this is incremental job growth. 17 million to 50 million in labor income, well over 80 million in economic value over 10 years in a very pretty rural county.
I think it was just the city.
Well, those are the county. I'm using the county numbers. So, isn't that enough from the public policy perspective to say we're going to do whatever we can, including public dollars and other things, tax credits, bond initiatives, all these things to bring jobs to our communities? Isn't that enough? I'd love to hear from y'all.
Well, if it doesn't make economic sense for the private sector to make that investment, and
Right.
it is so impactful, which all the studies show, then cities really have no chance. They're just going to have to figure out something to do on their own. And if that's the case, what does that look like? I think as long as cities are capable or they're allowed to do this sort of thing, then I think the cities can be real important players in bringing broadband to a broader swath of the country. To the extent that we're preempted from doing these things, then I don't think anybody is served. So I do think it's an important point to keep in mind that cities are going to play. They're playing in the interest of their citizens, and they're going to continue to try to do that regardless of what happens at the state or federal level. And there's a lot of things we can do, a lot of things that we're going to have to do on our own with collaborating potential, or with our local partners, with other cities, perhaps regionally, to try to come up with an approach that's going to bring that crucial economic development component to areas that are not going to be served because of their lack of economic viability from the private sector.
And it's not just hypothetical jobs that could be grown, it's holding on to jobs that are already there. We get calls all the time at the league from communities that say, have a business owner that has to start downloading files once work ends, because that's how long it will take until the next morning to get it downloaded. And he tells them honestly, I can't stay here if my business has to rely on this level of service. So I do think having maximum flexibility as far as public and private partnerships is the strategy.
Any other thoughts on that?
I know that Pittsburgh's looking at more of an open access approach than it is. We really aren't interested in running a cable franchise. Not really interested in that. We don't have fiber to the home, anything like that. It would be very expensive to do that. We're not willing to take on that debt to do that. We are connecting our community anchor institutions to the extent we can. We're running fiber. When we are running fiber, we're running 144 strands and putting handholds every other block. So we're making ourselves as flexible as possible. But it really boils down to what can we do with the really limited resources we have. I know cities, we care about streets and water and sewer. I mean, there's a ton of things that cities have to be concerned with. All of those things have economic development impacts. The other thing that you know from working in the city is that all of them are interrelated. They all interact with each other. Every piece of them, if you ignore one, you're really hurting the whole system. That's the economic system of your community. So we have to be concerned with all of those things, and we will be, and we'll continue to be. And broadband is one of those things that we'll have to move forward with, certainly on our own.
So here's a term that digital divide. It's a term that gets used and misused often. I like to misuse it. So digital divide, from where I'm based out of Seattle, where I understand we have the second loudest NFL fans in the NFL. But we see the digital divide issue as something that's an urban, not understanding the value. But there's digital divide in density and rurality. John Deere in recent comments, the FCC talking about their competitive disadvantage because they can't monitor their business, which is crops, because they don't have broadband out there. Affordability is key, and I know that's key for Heather. Maybe she could talk a little bit about that. So in some areas it's more of a supply side issue. In other areas it's a demand issue. Let's talk about digital divide and how we overcome that digital divide from the demand issue and bringing supply in. Any thoughts on affordability, perceived lack of value? I know, Jay, you probably see some of that in your town, perceived lack of value. And I know, Heather, you see the affordability issue in a big way.
Yeah.
Any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, our issue isn't necessarily availability, it's things have been done and there have been additional investments made, usually subsidized by one of our large employers that has to carry the cost, but that does help other businesses. Unfortunately, when you're looking at $2,000 a month for a 15-20 meg connection, when you have a business whose location in Austin, Texas gets a 20 meg connection for $100 a month.
Right.
I mean, when they're evaluating the costs of doing business, and broadband is just one facet. You've got the workforce development issue, you've got everything else. I mean, we need to have some kind of competitive edge at least, be on a level playing field so that they don't pack up operations and go where it is affordable and where there is a greater workforce. It's a big problem in rural. And I don't know that it's necessarily the lack of value. I think the value is understood in most of our business community, but it's the fact that they know what it's worth elsewhere.
Right.
And they don't have to stay.
Right. Any other thoughts on digital divide issues? Jay?
Yeah, we are, according to USA Today, we're the poorest county in Kansas. Crawford County is. Finally beat Cherokee County. I could argue with that, but obviously we have, cost is a factor. Really, we're not really into access questions anymore. We're beyond access questions. I mean, people can get broadband, and we in Pittsburgh actually we're pretty well served by our incumbent providers. We are. There's access to that almost all of our citizens. We're really boiling it down now though to questions of the quality of the connection, of the actual service around your service that you're getting, and of course the cost. So we're really not into access anymore. We're into those more what I would call competitive differentiation points. That would, if there were additional competition, then I think that we could see improvements in all of those areas. Those are the things that my businesses talk to me about. They don't talk about whether they can get it, because they can, all right? But fortunately in Pittsburgh. And they can get pretty high speeds if they want to. It's there. But what they want is quality service and cost related to all those.
And I'm going to open it up to the questions here in a minute. Catherine, real quick, any thoughts on Connect America Fund and what that might do to bridging some of the digital divide issues in rural Kansas, southwestern Kansas?
Sure, and I do want to follow up just a little bit on what Jay said from an affordability standpoint. I mean, business plans, when we start talking about real world business plans, I've been one of those people who have constantly defended, at least at the state level of Kansas, the KUSF, to help that affordability issue, because when it comes down to it, if you start to look at the actual business plan, the real world, you can throw as much competition as you want at a company like mine. There is still fixed costs that have to be paid in order to have those pipes. And you start to talk about, and now, I'm not talking about Pittsburgh, I'm talking about a Johnson City and a Rollin, a Richfield, much smaller communities. But in the end, our backhaul to Kansas City or south to Dallas starts to talk about huge dollars. Although I've gotten much better in the past couple of years, but you're still talking about having to make some sort of profit or at least not lose money on those connections. And so that becomes a question of, for a KUSF mechanism, it also becomes a conversation with the CAF, formerly Universal Service, of making those connections affordable. And that's, I think, exactly what those mechanisms are there to do. Given, I understand from a Pittsburgh and a Fort Scott situation, it's a little bit of a different animal just based on population where you're located versus where I'm located. And so it becomes a little bit of a different conversation, but that's the reason for those mechanisms, is that affordability, quality of service, and access to pipes that aren't just, here's a meg, have fun. And so I think those are the things that will contribute to making those connections available.
Lori, there's not going to be another BTOP, right?
I hope not. I mean, it's a blessing and a curse. I mean,
Yeah.
it was an extraordinary project that did an amazing amount of work in putting fiber, across the country. They were difficult projects in difficult conditions. At times, to do the project within 3 years in the parameters. I mean, it was a horse race marathon, is what it was. But it was an amazing time to tap into that. I don't see that happening in the same way probably in the future. And there's others in this room that may have more insight on that in terms of the federal outlook. But the Connect America Fund is probably the closest thing to VTOP that we will have moving forward. It seems to be where the national emphasis is, which is great, which is where it should be.
Great.
But yeah, VTOP certainly did a lot to spur the deployment and the conversation.
Good. Well, go ahead.
As far as like the Connect America goes, I know our little fiber group, broadband group in Fort Scott was eager and excited when we heard about your recent option, and then we've been on some conference calls and we started really looking, and it does nothing for us. I mean, because of your definition of what's served and what's not. I mean, here we are, we can't get investment from who's there, we can't get any kind of subsidies or grants because supposedly what we have is good enough. We're falling through the cracks.
Your Fort Scott is designated as a non-rural area and you don't receive as much funding. It's unfortunate, it's a regulatory problem, and I'm sure we'll continue to see problems as we move into Title II issues and more Connect America Fund issues. Mike Koss, any thoughts? One thing that I wanted to say, just my own plug for what I've seen working in this field for a while on broadband planning, is that broadband plans for communities seem to work when they're done locally and not pushed down from some higher power. But they need a helping hand. I know your communities don't really have paid staff to do take the broadband plans and take action on them, let alone build a broadband plan. And you're somewhere in the middle. The League of Municipalities is somewhere between the state and the city government itself and assisting. Any thoughts on how the league can help communities with not just the broadband planning, but getting these public-private partnerships set up, and how you can work with the state to make sure that there's some kind of general direction given down from the state, which has been fantastic under the leadership of Stan and the Department of Commerce, but may go away with the SBI program not being funded.
Well, one of our missions is to educate all of our members, and I think that us being a resource to them about some of these best practices that we can implement to incentivize deployment is probably the best thing we can do. Honestly, we get a lot more questions from cities than we do comments from contractors, ISPs, about how to help that process. And maybe we need to do more to reach out to the state, to reach out to the private sector on developing best practices. I personally am writing an article for our March magazine on this very issue. We're going to have a webinar in March as well about telecommunications issues, and at least a little bit about incentivizing broadband deployment. And I invite everybody here that has some ideas that you think would fit to share with cities to get in contact with us so we can share that with our members.
Yeah, well, that's the kind of thing that makes broadband planning and deployment work. I want to open it up for questions. I hope there are some to the audience, so please feel free. We actually have about 15 minutes here.
Throw something in on the broadband planning side of things.
Oh, sure.
I've seen a lot of communities around the country know they want to move forward with broadband initiatives, but not know exactly how. And they go one step too far first. And so I think really anyone looking at engaging in moving forward on a broadband initiative, no matter how small or how big, should definitely engage in a broadband plan and a strategic planning first. It needs assessment, feasibility, because there's really 4 elements that really help define what network you have, which is the regulatory and legal environment, the economic environment, and the geographic region. And as well as identifying stakeholders, regional partners, pulling together assets, existing assets that can be leveraged to help make your build more cost effective. All of those things should be identified before you take the first step of trying to find vendors to help you with the build and the design, the engineering, the connectivity pieces of it.
And you know all too well, having worked on VTOP, looking at what Broadband USA has through NTIA, the Federal Department of Commerce, it's a consistent message. A lot of learnings have been taken from this last 5 years of broadband planning, and locally works. State-run, federal-run does not necessarily. You know your communities better than the feds do or the state does, but you're spot on. You need to get a group. If you're going to start planning and build a plan, you need to get a group that has a kind of wide array of interests across the community. You need to gather data. That's 1A and 1B right there. So I'm going to open it up to questions for our panel. Yes?
It's for any or all the panelists.
Okay.
And it goes back to your comments in terms of policy. Are there rural policy pieces that should be considered to get past the conundrum of the business equation and businesses needing to make a profit from the service and the public benefit side of this as a utility?
Yeah, I'll take a first crack at that. And working for the FCC and the Department of Commerce, I know they're particularly interested in hearing from you all on that. And in terms of Connect America Fund funding, I think it's better targeted than it was in USF funding, telecommunications funding. But they also have these rural experiments that they're rolling out right now. I think it's just prefacing what anybody else on the panel has to say. I would take a look at what the FCC is doing with the rural experiments and the hundreds of millions of dollars that they're spending out in rural communities in Kansas and elsewhere, and look at what successes and what hasn't been a success, and comment. They want comments from communities. They specifically look for that. We in our work need to see that as well, so we know where to help them target funds. It is so important for you all to be involved with, especially with the Federal Communications Commission, but also with Broadband USA. So that's just a preface statement on my behalf, but go ahead.
And there's certainly some regulatory matters that can help, locally. Code changes potentially, looking at Dig Once initiatives, joint trenching, coordination with utilities for pole attachments, those kinds of efforts, they really generate some benefit. when you're looking at trying to minimize costs and work together.
Absolutely. All right, any other questions? There's gotta be questions.
I have a question. Is there a repository of success stories as a way for a community to say, okay, well, this is how they did it?
So, first and foremost, go out to the Kansas Department of Commerce website and look at the pilot communities. Now, it's way too early to say whether or not there's success in terms of action and what's been taught, but it's a good framework for you to see on how they started the planning process and how it was a very local community thing, local-driven community thing. And that's a good framework for any community in this room or elsewhere to use to start their planning process. But I'll open it. And you know, there's federal resources. Broadband USA is a fantastic resource. They have actually a toolkit PDF to look through to help you get started in that process. Google Fiber has their checklist, which has some value, but again, they have the checklist that you don't see too, and so does Catherine.
The secret checklist?
The secret sauce.
It's kind of like the secret.
Yeah, exactly.
I would echo what he's saying about the Department of Commerce, just because I think this has been one of Stan's big deals, is how can we get past the idea that we're just sitting here talking? What can we do to act on it, and how can we build those partnerships and those conversations? And that's been one of the key things for the Kansas Department of Commerce to do and to, I guess, to facilitate. And so I think that is really a great place to start. And if nothing else, it may be as simple as Stan going, well, I know so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so, and all three of them have really big mouths, so let's put you all together and help you out.
That's about it, right, Stan?
That is correct.
It's complicated in each community, in each situation. There's so many factors and variables that go into any kind of broadband deployment that it's hard to say, this is the best practice, this fit this community, so this is going to fit your community. I mean, there's
Right.
so many things that are not at all going to translate across from one area to the next. So
Right.
it's going to take a lot of time and effort and resources to even attempt to consider what the solutions are.
You can't use a cookie cutter approach either in planning or deployment. And we certainly learned that in our 5 years of broadband planning. We've tried cookie cutter approaches. In some instances, we've been yelled out of state houses, but we've learned that local planning from the community members itself is the only thing that works. And you have to have some kind of central authority that helps coordinate that effort across communities. Yeah, Stan.
I just want to, I apologize for being sitting on for the whole session. Funny thing, you can't sit in all your sessions. But the question about best practices is a good one, right? Or success stories. One of the things that we learned in our pilot project, for example, so you're hearing about what worked and how that worked. And I'm wondering if maybe Heather or someone else in the room maybe touches on the other side of that, right? There's a nuance where there are plenty of efforts that started that seemed like they were never going to get off the ground. So sometimes it is about that collaboration and stick to it, because the beginning is not easy, right? With the Fort Scott pilot project, it wasn't just, oh yeah, everybody shows up and everybody does what you need to do and we got a plan out. It didn't quite go like that, right?
No, not at all, and that's why I'm saying, I mean, it takes a tremendous amount of time and effort and energy, and part of the problem with getting the plan up and off the ground is the limitation of paid staff. You know, we're on tight budget, we're a economically depressed region of the state. We've got very, very, very limited staff. So when it comes to implementing, okay, great, we've got this wonderful idea and all these plans, but it takes somebody who is dedicated and focusing on that issue. And, you know, it's one thing, and so the city of Fort Scott, we were proactive, we recognized that. We hired, we didn't see it coming the way it played out, but we hired an IT director for that purpose. We said, okay, economic development, we recognize the importance of this. We need somebody to focus on this because our economic development department, me, is working on workforce development efforts, you know, downtown redevelopment, anything else you can, community development. So I don't have time to focus, so we hired somebody, and we have to be dedicated. I mean, the community has to take that step and say, we're going to invest in a resource and somebody that is going to focus on this. Unfortunately, not having had an IT director since 1842, that person has some catching up to do. But it's a priority, and that's where it has to be. It has to be a priority.
Appreciate that. Other question? Yes.
Mike, you mentioned Chanute earlier. Is that a model out of Fort Scott or Pittsburgh? Or
Actually, I think Heather would know more about it than I do. I just know that for a long time they've been planning fiber and have deployed some.
And another one size doesn't fit all. They
Right.
have their own municipal electric, we don't, and so it just doesn't fit us.
Pittsburgh is not willing to make that level of investment. Right. I guess we could. We have certainly have the debt capacity to do that. That's not going to happen. So,
At some point, do you feel that there will be more critical mass on understanding the economic impact of broadband, where it may lead to more investment, public investment?
Possibly. I mean, if the investments, to bring fiber so the kids can play games better at home, that's not really the kicker.
Netflix is really cool.
Netflix is great, but when you get watching a show in the middle of Netflix and all of a sudden it goes down, that frustrates people. But that's not really where the public funds are right. Public funds is going.
To tag along that, I think what you're saying, it comes down to educating. You've got to educate your community. You've got to make them understand and recognize the value for the sustainability of small town America, that it is worth whatever investment. And I'm not saying we want to pursue any kind of municipal fiber network, we don't. But if we want to maybe raise taxes so that we can afford to increase our budget on our public works projects so that we can go ahead and help put some infrastructure in the ground for whoever wants to use it. We have to educate the community to see the value in that.
Yes.
Just kind of to add to and talk to what you guys have said, Shekinah Bailey with RUS, Department of Agriculture. One of the things that I've seen, I've been in this position for a year, is there are tons of models from what you're doing to communities that have gone in and bought their own fiber, built it out, and worked with, I think it's Rainbow Telecommunications, to manage their program, to communities going in and paying rural telecos to come build their areas out. There's a lot of different models out there, but some of the economic benefits are out there, and there are success stories. I think Madison is probably one of the best. Madison Telephone, which is about 30 minutes south of Emporia, with one of the manufacturers that they have there that started out through a rural telecom loan, a red leg loan through Department of Agriculture, and now they're the largest UPS shipper in the state of Kansas, this little manufacturing company. So there are a lot of success stories. They've also seen an increase in home values that they have fiber to of 5 to 10% in their community. So there are lots of success stories out there, and there are the groups that will come, and I'll come to any community in Kansas. I'm the Kansas rep. And help you in any way I can, but there's lots of success stories out there, and there's lots of different models, and it's just bringing the different groups together, bringing your education, your hospitals, your clinics, your schools, your higher education, your state and your federal officials together, and sitting them in a room and saying, okay, what do you need? What does the community want? What are the services that we can do? And then what's the best model to do that, whether it be wireless or whether it be fiber, whether it be a backbone to the anchor institutions with wireless off of that. There's a lot of different models out there that have worked. And we see communities all over the state that are doing some of these things.
That's great. And just to plug your services, you have the premier telco, rural telco lender in the country right there. So just,
Another plug, our broadband program. Our
Our
broadband program opens back up, which was reauthorized under in March, which allows for not just telcos, but for communities, organizations, and everything else like that to borrow money. And right now, our interest rates for our loan portion of it are extremely cheap, and financially, there's a lot of business sense to some of our loans with some of the programs that we have with them. So I'm more than willing to come to talk to anybody about any of that.
Thank you for speaking up. Love RUS. Other questions? Yeah.
It just seems like a lot of cities, areas already have 2 or 3 providers, but the citizens aren't happy with the options. But because you already have 2 or 3 providers, it's just so hard to get someone else to come in who's going to invest and compete against our competition that's already established.
Right, and part of that is just a result of the natural monopoly process, and I'm not picking on you, but there's carriers of last resort is what they're called. It's a common carrier who has the obligation to serve every last street and house in their certificated area, and that's going to be where you're going to go. And then the competitive providers typically don't have the funding to support your needs as well as that certificated provider. So in rural areas, it's just really difficult to get that competition out there. Now there are Wi-Fi small WISPs, as we call them, wireless providers, that do provide a product that's pretty good in some rural areas. But yeah, I mean, it's a problem that's not going to be resolved anytime real soon. On the federal USF side, there is a fund for mobility that actually funds rural mobile broadband. That you can see that as competitors coming into the area where there's a certificated provider and providing mobile broadband at sometimes pretty hefty speeds. So that funding is coming out over the next couple of years, and that's $300 million.
Have these speeds with data caps?
I'm sorry?
Are there data caps on these speeds?
Perhaps, but in relative terms, for mobility, it's getting to where it's a serviceable option that's maybe better than satellite without the latency issues. And I know Elon Musk is putting up a bunch of satellites, but that's not going to be anytime soon.
Just
Yes.
challenge at one point, there is no carrier of last resort in Kansas anymore.
As a
Legislature repealed.
That's right. So a little less regulation from Kansas. Yeah, for AT&T. Which is a price cap. Yeah, she has full obligations. But yeah, AT&T serves much of the state, and they're a different carrier. But that's a good point. Thank you. Other questions? Well,
I know over time, but last year there was an attempt in the state legislature, I'm not versed on the details, so pardon me if I have this wrong, to prohibit municipalities from undertaking municipal broadband. Do you see a future for that this time around? I meant what about
Is it-
no.
Are you saying is there a future for that legislation?
Yes, in other words, yes, is it dead or not?
Larry, I will say that, there are some legislators out there that aren't always great friends of cities that understood on this issue that it's not good for Kansas. And I think for that reason, it probably doesn't have a lot of potential for coming back, but we're always going to be wary of it.
It's a really good question, and I would say that, as I said earlier, everything is tinged by this Title II issue. And if you're going to be regulated as a common carrier and you're a municipality, you need to think twice about what that looks like, because you have inter-carrier compensation rules, you have all these other rules, obligations that you need to start thinking about. So it may be more complicated, we don't know, but it's a great question. Any other questions? Well, I would like to thank our panelists. Very nice job. Thank you. Very diverse set of opinions and knowledge sets. I'd like to thank Bill McGuire. Where are you, Bill? Oh, thank you for helping facilitate this. Angel Seifert for being the logistics czar, and Stan Adams for putting this all together. We appreciate all of this.